Welcome to Hockeywiztalks podcast. Today I'll be talking about the biggest NHL rivalries of all time. This is the first part of a podcast series I am doing on NHL rivalries. In this podcast, I'm going to be talking about three of the biggest NHL rivalries of all time. Boston Bruins versus Montreal Canadiens. This is considered to be one of the greatest rivalries in not only the NHL, but in all of sports. Former players who have played in this rivalry have claimed it to rank right up there with the Yankees and Red Sox rivalry. The two teams have played each other more times in both regular season play and Stanley Cup playoffs combined than any other two teams in NHL history. Through the conclusion of the 2020-21 season, the two teams have played each other a total of 927 times, with the Canadiens winning 469 games and the Bruins winning 348 games, with 103 ties. In the playoffs, the two teams have met in 34 series for a total of 177 playoff games, and the teams have faced each other in Game 7s 9 times, more than any pair of opponents in NHL history. The violence in the game between the heated rivals ultimately led to the Richard riot, and the Boston police even attempted to arrest Maurice Richard after the game. The Bruins and Canadiens made up 16 of the possible 30 Stanley Cup Finals appearances between 1965 and 1979. The Bruins went 2-3, whereas the Canadiens went 10-1 in the finals appearances. The only finals that neither team appeared in during this period was in 1975, which was a showdown between the Philadelphia Flyers and Buffalo Sabres. The Bruins and Canadiens reigned exclusively as Stanley Cup champions, except in 1967 when the Cup was won by the Toronto Maple Leafs and the Philadelphia Flyers in 1974-1975. The rivalry continued through the 1980s, where both teams made up 4 of the possible 10 final appearances from 1986 to 1990. The only finals that neither team appeared in during that time was in 1987, which was a showdown between the Philadelphia Flyers and Edmonton Oilers. The rivalry died down a bit in the 1990s and early 2000s, but the rivalry was reignited in 2007. On June 22, 2007, during the offseason, former Canadiens coach Claude Julien was named head coach of the Boston Bruins, and despite the success under Julien, the Habs still seemed to always have success against the Bruins. In 2011, during a regular season game in which the Bruins won 8-6, there was a brawl in which all-star goalies Carey Price and Tim Thomas fought. It featured an additional 6 fights and a total of 187 penalty minutes. On March 8th, the Canadiens defeated the Bruins 4-1, but the game was marred by the Bruins' Zdeno Chara checking the Habs' Max Pacioretty into the glass between the players' bench areas with 15.8 seconds left in the second period. He was knocked unconscious on impact and was taken to the hospital on a stretcher. The Habs and Pacioretty were furious that the NHL didn't suspend Chara for the hit. By the time the Habs and Canadiens matched up in the first round of the 2011 playoffs, it had already been the 33rd time these two teams met in the postseason, and was by far the most frequent playoff series in NHL history. The Bruins went on to defeat the Canadiens and made it all the way to the Stanley Cup Finals before defeating the Vancouver Canucks in 6 games to win the Stanley Cup. And it was the first time in which they had beaten Montreal en route to winning a Stanley Cup since 1929. Boston and Montreal had been in the same division for the vast majority of seasons since that time. The exception came in the 1970s, when the Bruins were placed in the Adams division and the Canadiens in the Norris division. The other exception was in the 2020-21 season, in which the COVID pandemic forced a temporary divisional realignment and forced Montreal to play in an all-Canadian division, while Boston played in an Atlantic Metro hybrid division. There's also an element of a Canadian-US rivalry going on here, as both fan bases feel like their teams are the true representation of the sport. And now a word from our sponsor. Check out my scouting blog at Hockeywist777scouting.com. Listen to my scouting blog podcast on podcasters.spotify.com/pod/show/Hockeywist77scouting. Edmonton Oilers versus Calgary Flames. The Battle of Alberta is one of the most fierce and intense rivalries in hockey. But not only is it a battle of supremacy on the ice, but it's also a battle of supremacy between the two cities off the ice as well. The rivalry also extends outside the team sports to international events, as both cities have hosted numerous national and international championships. Since 1980, the Battle of Alberta has been one of the most intense and passionate rivalries in the sport. For much of this time, both the Calgary Flames and Edmonton Oilers were the two best teams in the Campbell Conference, and by some teams' account, in the entire league. One of those two teams represented the Campbell Conference in the Stanley Cup Finals for 8 consecutive years from 1983 to 1990, the Oilers 6 times and the Flames 2 times. During this time span, Alberta won 6 of 8 Stanley Cup championships, with the Oilers winning 5 cups, a feat that has not been replicated since. The Edmonton Oilers from 1983 to 1990 are recognized as the NHL's last great dynasty, with lineups through this period that featured Hall of Famers Wayne Gretzky, Glenn Anderson, Paul Coffey, Grant Fuhr, Yari Curry, and Mark Messier, while being coached by Hall of Famer Glenn Sather. While the Flames only won the Stanley Cup in 1989, they were still littered by Hall of Fame superstars like Lanny McDonald, Doug Gilmour, Al McGinnis, Joe Mullen, and Joel Nieuwendyk. This period of repeated confrontations in the 80s was mainly due to the way playoffs were structured back then, as the top 4 teams in each division made the playoffs and the winners of each divisional round met in the conference finals. As both the Flames and Oilers were both in the Smythe division, it made it very likely that they would face each other in either the first or second round, en route to the conference finals. The Oilers defeated the Flames in the playoffs in 1983, 1984, 1988, and 1991 on their way to 2 of 5 Stanley Cups. The Flames defeated the Oilers in the 1986 NHL playoffs. While the Flames were favored in the 1988 playoffs, having won the President's Trophy, the Oilers swept the series and went on to win the Stanley Cup that year. Due to the sheer talent and skill exhibited by both teams in the mid to late 1980s, Alberta was considered a death valley for teams coming to play for a road trip, especially those from the Wales Conference. With the changes to the regular season schedule from the 1991-92 season onward, the two teams no longer had to play each other 8 times a year, which caused the rivalry to cool off a bit in the 1990s and early 2000s. As they didn't play each other much, falling only to 4 times a year by the 2016-17 season, besides the 2020-21 season where they played 10 times exclusively because they were in an all-Canadian team division due to the COVID pandemic. The rivalry saw a revival early in 2020 during a January game in 2020 in which Calgary's Matthew Tkachuk and Edmonton's Zach Kassian began to feud. After receiving 2 hits from Matthew Tkachuk, in which the hits were predatory, Kassian tried to fight Tkachuk, but the Calgary winger turtled. The two teams matched up in the 2022 playoffs in the semifinals, where the Oilers won the series in 5 games on a Connor McDavid game-winning goal. Check out my hockey blog at hockeywiztalkshockey.blogspot.com. Follow me on Facebook and Instagram at Hockeywiz777. New Jersey Devils versus New York Rangers. This rivalry is better known as the Hudson River Rivalry, and the two teams have been dubbed as cross-river rivals. The Devils-Rangers rivalry is the one that matters the most, at least to Devils fans, because they want to prove that they are the best team in the tri-state area. The rivalry's most famous moments are centered around the significance of the team's meetings during the 1993-94 and 1994-95 seasons. In the 1994 Eastern Conference Finals, the Devils got up to a 3-1 lead in the series, but Mark Messier put the team on his back and scored a hat-trick in Game 6, in which he guaranteed a victory to force a Game 7. Then in Game 7, Stephane Matteau scored the game-winning goal in overtime to send the Rangers to the Stanley Cup Finals. They would go on to win this 1994 Stanley Cup in 7 games over the Vancouver Canucks. The Devils recovered from the crushing defeat to win the Stanley Cup the following year in 1995 with an improbable sweep over the President's Trophy winning Detroit Red Wings. After defeating another one of the rivals, the Philadelphia Flyers, who had defeated the Rangers in the semifinals. In 1997, the third Devils-Rangers playoff series occurred, just 3 years later, where the Rangers, led by Mark Messier, Wayne Gretzky, Brian Leetch, and Mike Richter, eliminated the Devils in the Eastern Conference semifinals, winning 4 games in a row after Game 1. From the start of 1998, however, the rivalry shifted drastically in favor of the Devils. New Jersey dominated New York in the late 1990s and early 2000s. At one point, the Devils had an unbeaten streak against the Rangers throughout 23 regular season games, going 15-0-8, starting February 17, 1997 and ending March 31st, 2001. An undefeated streak spanning 4 years. In the 2005-2006 season, after winning 11 straight games to win the Atlantic Division, the Devils matched up against the Rangers in the 2006 Eastern Conference quarterfinals. The result was a 4-game sweep of the Cross River rivals. After longtime Devils Scott Gomez signed as a free agent in 2007, he was severely booed at the Prudential Center every time he touched the puck. In Game 3 of the 2008 playoffs, Sean Avery waved his hands and stick in front of goaltender Martin Brodeur's face while not even facing play. This would force the league to impose the Sean Avery rule. The last time the Devils and Rangers matched up in the playoffs was in the 2012 Eastern Conference Finals, where the Devils won the series in 6 games on an Adam Henrique overtime game-winning goal. However, the Devils would go on to lose in the Stanley Cup Finals to the LA Kings in 6 games. Players who have played in this rivalry have deep hatred for one another, and every matchup between the two teams is much-watched TV. Listen to Hockeywiztalks podcast on Podbean and Spotify. Check out my YouTube channel at youtube.com/HockeyWizTravels. There are many more rivalries to talk about, so be sure to tune in for my next podcast to find out what rivalries I'll talk about next.